Hello, Educate community, and welcome back. If it's your first time here, my name is Rebecca Simons, and this is the channel where we discuss all things ed tech. We're back today with part 2 in our Google Forms series. In this module, we're going to be stepping up our game and doing a deep dive into some of the more advanced Google Forms topics. If you're interested in a specific topic or want to review a skill at your own pace, I've included a time-stamped list of all the topics we'll be covering in the description down below. So let's go ahead and get started. As a former classroom teacher and now an instructional technology coach, I understand what it means to have a full plate. And that's why I'm always looking for ways to create efficiencies within my workflow. One way you can use your time more efficiently is to set up your Google form to auto-grade. Not only is it a time saver, but having access to the data immediately gives you the time to analyze it and act on it even within the same class period. Additionally, instead of spending your time checking for completion or accuracy on those lower level DOK assignments, you can actually spend your time giving feedback on the more critical thinking assignments, which is where we all know we would rather be spending our time. So let's go ahead and tap into some of that Google Forms magic and set up our form to auto grade. To set up your form for auto grading, you're going to want to start by turning it into a quiz. You can do this by clicking on the Settings tab, then toggling on the switch, Make this a quiz. Next, you'll want to review your quiz settings. The first thing you need to decide is if you want your grades to be released immediately or after you've had a chance to look at them. If I include any type of open response question that has to be manually scored, I always turn on later after manual review because without fail, my students would panic when they saw their grade and I would have to remind them that they really didn't fail, that I still needed to go in and score several of the open response questions. Locked mode allows you to prevent students from opening other tabs while in the form. This is great if you don't want students to be able to look up information on the internet. However, as an ELA teacher, I found this challenging because frequently I would need to link longer passages for students to open, and putting the form in locked mode prevented this. Next up are respondent settings. Here you can choose what respondents are going to see. Missed questions shows students what they missed after they hit submit. Correct answers allow students to see what the correct answer was for the questions they missed. Whether you turn these options on or not is going to depend on how you're using the assignment. For example, if I was giving an assessment, I would keep both of these options toggled off to help decrease cheating. However, if I was doing a practice activity in class, I might turn on missed questions, leave correct answers off, then allow students to go back in and edit their responses so they have the opportunity to learn from their mistakes and try again. Point values allows students to see how many points the entire assignment is worth and how much individual questions are worth. I always leave this setting on. And in fact, it helped me several times when I accidentally forgot to remove points for putting in your first and last name, and my students caught it for me. Finally, you have the default point value. If you know that the majority of your questions are going to be worth, let's say, 5 points, then go ahead and change the default so you aren't having to go in and modify each question's point value individually. Next, I want to quickly review a couple of response settings. Even though we covered these in Module 1, I want to review them again in the context of setting up a quiz. We're going to be looking at the options allow response editing and limit to one response. Whether you toggle these options on or off is going to depend on what kind of an assignment you're using your Google form for. For example, allow response editing is going to allow respondents to go back in and change their answers after hitting submit. If I were giving an assessment like a test or a quiz, I would want to make sure to have this turned off. If I were using my form as a learning activity, I might want to leave this toggled on. That way, if students weren't able to complete the assignment during a single class period, they could come back and pick up with their work right where they left off. Limit to one response is going to make sure that students only submit one copy of the Google form. This setting is incredibly important to have toggled on if you're planning on importing your scores from your Google form over into Google Classroom. And I'll talk more about why that is during our Google Classroom section of this module. Now, even though we've toggled on Make This a Quiz, we still have to go in and set the form up to auto grade. To do this, you'll go in and click on each question and select Answer Key in the bottom left-hand corner. Then you'll go through and select the correct answer. Now, any response that's submitted will automatically be checked against this answer and scored as right or wrong. Under the Answer Key, you can also modify how many points each question is worth. This number is pulling from the default that we set up under settings, but we can go in and manually change how much an individual question is worth. For example, if I wanted my students to put their first and last name, I would want to go in and make those questions worth 0 points. If you're using your form as a learning activity, you might want to also consider putting in answer feedback. You can add feedback for both correct and incorrect answers. For example, maybe if your student gets a problem incorrect, you want to provide them with a link to a short review video they can watch before they reattempt the question. Now, for multiple choice, check boxes, drop down, or the grid questions, setting up auto grading is pretty straightforward. All you'll need to do is click on Answer Key and mark the correct answers. Other question types, like short answer and paragraph for open response questions, linear scale, date and time, are automatically going to be marked as incorrect and are going to require you to go in and manually score them. This is also true for questions where students can provide multiple answers if you want to give partial credit. For example, if I wanted to include a checkbox question and say, select all correct answers, and there were 3 correct answers, but my student only got 2 of them, the entire question would be marked as incorrect. If I wanted to give them 2 points as partial credit, I would have to go in and do that manually. Now, I spent a lot of time talking about manually reviewing or manually scoring questions, so let me walk you through that process. For demonstration purposes, I've included a really basic open response question. 2 + 2 =, and then respondents would type in their answer. Once your students have finished submitting their responses, you would begin by clicking on the Responses tab. Now, in Module 1, we talked about there are 3 different ways to view responses within forms: summary, question, and individual. Anytime I need to score an open response question, I always go to question. Click the drop down to select the question you want to score. In our case, we only have 1. Then you can go through and use the green check or the red X to mark answers as correct or incorrect. So check, X, X. I can also give partial credit for an answer simply by clicking and typing in how much credit I want to give. Another feature that I love about grading by question is that I can blind grade. This was particularly great as an ELA teacher when I needed to grade short answers because I wasn't being biased by a student name. If you want to see who submitted a response, simply click on the one ungraded response and it's going to give you the email associated with that answer if you collected emails. If you're doing any kind of grading or work with students, I would always turn on email collection. Once you're finished scoring all of the responses, don't forget to click Save. Now, because we manually scored responses, students don't know what their final score is. If you're planning on entering your scores in Google Classroom or another LMS, then don't worry about this next step. If you aren't entering your scores anywhere else, but you still want your students to know how they did, you're going to click on the Summary tab and scroll down to click on the button Release Scores. As long as you've collected email addresses, it's going to email all of the respondents their final score and an optional message. All you have to do is click Send Emails and Release. Here's an example of what that email would look like on the student end. Now, because I use Google Classroom, I never released my scores from the Google form. Instead, I would import the scores into Google Classroom and then release them from there. So let's jump over to Google Classroom for a few moments and talk about how it integrates with Google Forms. If you're planning on using a Google form with your students, you want to think about how you can easily get it into their hands. And Google Classroom is a perfect way to achieve this. To share a form in Google Classroom, you're going to start by navigating to the class you want to share with, then click on the Classwork tab. From here, you're going to click Create Assignment. Now, Google also gives you the option to create a quiz assignment, but I personally never use this option, and here's why. This option prompts Google Classroom to create a blank form, which is then stored under the Google Classroom folder in your Google Drive under the folder for that specific class. Personally, I prefer to have all of my forms organized under my own filing structure in Drive. That way I can easily find, modify, and reuse them from year to year, and I don't have to remember which class I stored the form under. So for our purposes today, we're going to click with Create Assignment. This will pop up a window where you can title your assignment, add your instructions, and then attach the Google form you've created. You can add your form by copying and pasting the link using the link icon or by locating it in your Drive. Now let's address grading in Google Classroom. As we talked about earlier, one of the greatest benefits to using forms is its ability to auto-grade. But there are a couple things you need to remember if you're planning on importing your scores from your form into Google Classroom. Google Classroom gives you the ability to directly import your grades from your Google form. However, there are a couple tips you need to know to make sure you don't run into any hiccups whenever you are importing your grades. Tip number 1 is to make sure that the grade importing toggle is enabled. When you attach a form to an assignment in Google Classroom and turn on grade importing, it's automatically going to modify some of the settings in the form. If you read this fine print down at the bottom, it says grade importing automatically limits each form to one response per user, collects email addresses, and restricts responses to users in your domain. You need these settings to be enabled for grade importing to work correctly. I do have one caveat to that statement. From experience, I have been able to open it up so that users outside of my domain could take the quiz and still successfully import my grades into Google Classroom. Here's the catch. If a student registers in the Google Classroom using their domain email, but they take the quiz using their personal email, then when Forms tries to match emails in Google Classroom so it can bring over the scores, it's not going to find a match, so it won't know where to put that student's score. In those cases, I had to manually bring student scores in. If all of your users are going to be within your domain, I wouldn't worry about it and I would just leave that setting checked. Tip number 2, this grade importing toggle will automatically not be available if you have attached anything besides the form to your assignment. For example, if I were to add a Google Doc to this assignment, you would see that this is automatically grayed out and I don't have the option to toggle it on. So if you do need to provide some kind of a supplemental resource for your Google Form activity, you would need to provide it by linking it in the instructions within the form itself, or you could post a separate material or assignment in Google Classroom. Tip number 3. If your quiz includes any questions that need to be manually scored, you should do this before you import your grades. If you forget, it's not a big deal. You'll simply need to re-import your scores again. Any changes that you make to students' scores in Google Forms are not going to auto-update in Google Classroom. So we've been talking a lot about how to successfully set up importing grades, so let's actually walk through how to do it together. To get started, you're going to navigate to your assignment and click on Student Work. Then you're going to click on the Import Grades button in the upper right corner. Sometimes this isn't automatically visible for me, so I'll click the refresh button and then it appears. Now, as you can see here, I have 2 different categories, turned in and assigned. This person down here has completed the form, but they didn't press submit in Google Classroom. Now, to me, this isn't a big deal. As long as I've got a score, we're great. But I know for some teachers, they like for their students to get in the habit of always pressing submit. Now that my grades are in Google Classroom, I'm going to return the assignments to students, which will send them an email notification letting them know what their final score was. I'm going to click the checkbox up by Turned In to select everyone who has a score under Turned In. Then I'm also going to come down and manually check the one person who forgot to hit submit, so their score is returned as well. Then I'm simply going to click the Return button. You'll know you've been successful when everything is under the category Graded. All right, let's switch back over to Google Forms and dig a little deeper into managing and analyzing responses. Let's start by talking about how you can control whether your form is accepting responses. Maybe you have a sign-up sheet or a registration form that you want to close down after a specific date. To shut down your form, click on the Responses tab, then toggle off Accepting Responses. Message for respondents is the text that will be displayed anytime someone tries to access your forms and can be customized to suit your needs. Next, let's take a look at the More menu for responses. There are some incredibly useful features here, like get email notifications for new responses. This is great if you want to be notified each time your form is filled out, so you don't have to remember to monitor it for submissions. If you're expecting a lot of responses at once, you might want to wait until the initial wave has passed, then turn this on for any stragglers. When I was teaching, I liked to use this to catch late work submissions. Now I have this turned on for forms like my course evaluation or my badge request form, things that don't get filled out as commonly, and I don't want to have to check them routinely. Under the Responses More menu, you'll also see the option to download and print responses. These are fairly self-explanatory, allowing you to either make digital or physical copies of your responses. Then there's the Delete All Responses feature. This can be useful if you submitted several test responses to make sure that your form was working, and you want to clear them out before you send out your form officially. However, you need to be really careful with this feature because once you delete your responses, they aren't recoverable. In Module 1, we talked about how there are 3 main ways to view your data in Google Form: Summary View, Question View, and Individual View. But really, there's a 4th way you can view your data, and that is Response Destination, allowing you to see your data in Google Sheets. And let me tell you, Forms integration with Sheets is where the true magic starts to happen. The ability to link your Forms data into Sheets might just be my all-time favorite feature of Forms. The ability to look at your data in Sheets is amazing because it gives you the ability to sort, filter, analyze the responses you've collected, or simply create a historical copy of your data. Now, it's important to remember that the data in Google Sheets is simply a copy of your responses. Altering the data in Sheets is not going to alter the information in Forms. Also, deleting a response in your form is not going to delete it from the Google Sheet and vice versa. To create a spreadsheet of your responses, you can click on the link to Sheets, or you can click on the More menu, then select Destination for Responses. When you initially link to Sheets, you'll be given the option to create a new sheet or link to an existing one. Here's what linking to a brand new sheet would look like. And here's what it would look like if I linked to an existing form. As you can see, it simply created a new tab down at the bottom. So I have my original data and then the new data in a separate tab. I love the ability to link to an existing spreadsheet because it makes it easy to compare data from different time periods if I'm reusing a form, or I can even bring in data from different forms into one master spreadsheet. Now, if you're anything like me, you will frequently find yourself in the position where you can find the spreadsheet, but you can't find the original form. Luckily, Google's one step ahead of me. And if you go to the Tools menu and click on Manage Form, you'll be given the option to open your form to edit, or you can click Go to Live Form to fill the form out as a participant. Now let's talk about reusing forms. Let's imagine that you have a form that you used last semester. You want to use the form again, but with a new set of students. Instead of making a copy of the form and having multiple copies floating around our drive, we can get the same form ready to reuse in a few simple steps. If you're wanting to reuse your Google form, the first thing you'll want to do is create a record of your current data by making sure your form is linked to a Google Sheet. After you've captured your historical data, you'll come back to your form, click on the Responses tab, then select the More menu. From here, you're going to click Unlink Form, which will disconnect your form from the Google Sheet. Next, you'll click the More menu again and select Delete All Responses. Just remember, when you delete your responses, there's no way to recover them, which is why I advised creating a historical copy of your data in the Google Sheet before doing this step. Now that your form is blank and ready to reuse, you can link it to a new Google Sheet, or you can relink it to your existing Google Sheet. As we talked about earlier, the new responses are going to be stored on their own tab, but linking to the same sheet is going to allow you to quickly look at your current and past data from one location. As you can see here, the purple icon shows you which tab your form is linked to. So all of my new responses will come in here. If I click on the previous tab, I'll see a historical record of all of my past responses. Now, as I mentioned earlier, what I feel like makes Forms truly magical is its integration with Google Sheets. However, using Sheets makes a lot of people nervous or uncomfortable. So I want to spend a little bit of time in this module giving you some tips for how you can look at your responses in Google Sheets. All right, I have pulled together some actual data from when I was teaching. And before anybody panics, all of the data is de-identified. ChatGPT actually helped me come up with all the first and last names. This is what my data might look like when I first link it from my Google form. So here's how I would approach getting it ready to look at. The first thing I'm going to do is click row 1, and I'm going to select the text wrapping icon. This is going to make it to where I can read the entire question for each column. Next, I'm going to click on this gray cell to select my entire sheet. Then I'm going to move my cursor over the small line between column A and B, and I'm going to double click. This is automatically going to resize all of my columns so that I can read the text that's in them. The next thing I like to do is start freezing parts of my data. This allows me to keep parts of my Google Sheet visible no matter how far down I scroll in my sheet. Right now, if I scroll too far down in my sheet or scroll too far over, I'm not able to see whose record I'm looking at or which question I'm looking at. So to get started, I'm going to right-click on row 1, hover over View More Row Actions, and select Freeze up to row 1. I also like to freeze my demographic data or information that I'm going to want to be able to look at no matter where I scroll at in the form. So I'm going to begin by clicking on the last column that I want to freeze, which is column D with the score. Then I'm going to click on View, Freeze, up to column D. This is just another way to go about freezing your data other than right-clicking. Now, no matter where I scroll in my form, I can see the questions and I can see the student names. As a side note, whenever I'm building a form, I always ask for the demographic data at the beginning of the form for this reason. On top of that, I always create a separate question for first name and last name because when the data imports from the form, it's going to place each question in its own column. This means I would be able to alphabetize by first name or last name depending on my needs. If you teach multiple sections of a course, I would also advocate for including a question where students can record what class period they're in. I always make this either multiple choice or a drop down to ensure that I'm getting uniform responses. Otherwise, there is no telling how your students will enter the information. For example, you might get, let's say for 7th period, you might get period 7, you might just get a 7, you might get 7 spelled out, you might get 7 with a dollar sign. By allowing students the freedom to enter that information as an open response, you would have to standardize all this data before you could accurately sort it. Now, sorting is one of the quickest ways to make your data actionable and usable. To perform a basic sort, you are going to click on the arrow to the right of any column and select Sort A to Z or Z to A. For example, you might use this if you wanted to sort all of your students alphabetically by last name. If you want to sort by multiple data fields, you're going to need to use an advanced sort. To complete an advanced sort, you're going to click in the gray cell in the corner to select your entire sheet, then click Data, Sort Range, Advanced Range Sorting Options. Check that your data has a header row, then add the fields you want to sort by and in what order. For example, I might want to sort my sheet by reading block, then by last name. Now I have all of my students listed alphabetically for block A1, A2, A3, and then for my B blocks as well. Another feature I really like to use is the filter tool. Filters are going to allow you to quickly hide or show specific rows in your sheet based on your criteria. When I was teaching 7th grade, I loved to have all 6 of my class periods use the same form, like my example here, so that all of their data was in one location. However, that made it difficult to look for trends by a single class period. By adding a filter, I could easily look at the data for a single class without having to alter any of my original data. So let's walk through a quick demo of how to filter together. To add a filter, you're going to click on Data, Create Filter. If multiple people are currently viewing the sheet you're in, you'll have the option to filter the data for just you or for everyone. You'll know that you've applied a filter successfully if you see this little drop-down arrow in your header row. When you click on the arrow, you'll see a drop-down menu with a variety of options. We could dive really deep into filters and spend a lot of time here, but I'm just going to briefly showcase what's possible. You can filter by color, a certain condition, or by values. For example, if I only wanted to see the responses for my A1 block, I would clear out the values, select A1, and say OK. Now my sheet is only displaying the data for A1. Now, before you panic, all of the other data is simply hidden, not deleted. If you're using filters, it's really important to remove the filter so that you can see all of your data again. You can tell which column you have filtered by whatever has the little funnel on it. You can remove it by clicking and saying select all, OK, or you can come up to data and say remove filter. Now, what if you just want to hide some rows or columns temporarily, but you don't want to go the whole route of adding a filter? No problem. All you need to do is highlight the rows or columns that you temporarily want to hide, right-click, and say hide. To unhide your data, you're going to click on the little arrow that appears where your data is hidden. Another feature that I like to add whenever I'm looking at my data in Sheets is alternating row color. This is a small change, but it helps your eyes to track across your data and it improves the overall readability of your sheet. You're going to begin by selecting the rows that you want to apply alternating color to. In my case, I just want to apply it to my whole sheet. So I'm going to click on that gray cell in the upper corner, or you could press Control A, Command A if you're on a Mac. Then you're going to click on Format, Alternating Color. Check whether your data has a header or not. Then you can choose from the default color schemes or set up one of your own. My final tip is a brief introduction to conditional formatting. Conditional formatting is a great way to visually identify trends, such as highlighting anyone who scored below 75% in red. Maybe you want to do that so you know who to pull for small group for reteaching. Conditional formatting is simply a fancy way to say, apply this formatting to this range of data when these conditions are met. You're going to begin by selecting the range that you want to apply your formatting to. In our case, we might want to select the score for this assignment. Then you're going to click on Format, Conditional Formatting. Next, you're going to set your condition. In our example, we want formatting to be applied to cells that are a score of 13 out of 18, which would be 72%. So under Format Rules, I'm going to click on the drop-down and select less than or equal to, and type in the value 13 out of 18. If these conditions are met, then I want the cell fill color to be red. And then I'm going to make the text white so that it's a little easier to read that score. You'll see that all of the matching cells changed color instantly. Now I have a visual way to quickly tell who I might want to pull for each block for a small group lesson. Again, I might want to apply that filter where I'm only looking at a single class period at a time. And additionally, I could then filter to where I'm only looking at the people who I need to pull for small group. All right, I know that was fast and furious, but there is so much depth to Sheets. Someday I'll get brave enough to do a badge course on Sheets, but hopefully for now, this was enough to give you a jump start in some different ways that you can look at your data and analyze it to make actionable decisions. All right, we're going to be wrapping up our time in Module 2 by talking about all of the different options you can find for each question type under the More menu. As you can see in this table, you'll find different options for each question type. We're going to briefly cover all of the options and what they do, but we're going to spend the majority of our time talking about response validation and go to section based on answer, also known as form branching. You can find the More menu for any question first by selecting the question, then clicking on the three dots in the bottom right-hand corner. Every single question is going to have the description option. This is going to allow you to add additional text directly under your question. It will appear in a smaller font and is an opportunity for you to give a few additional directions about your question. If you're using the question type multiple choice, checkboxes, drop-down, multiple choice grid, or a checkbox grid, you're going to be given the option to shuffle your answer choices. Now, as we talked about in Module 1, I really don't like to shuffle my question order, but I'm all about shuffling my answer choices. Here's what this will look like in action. When I preview my form, you can see that the correct answer, recreation, appears second. However, for another student, recreation might appear third. And for yet another student, it might appear first. If you're using a multiple choice grid question or a checkbox grid question, you have the ability to require a response in each row, but additionally under the More menu, you can limit respondents to only choosing a single response per column. Let me demo what this question looks like with this option selected and unselected. When I have this setting turned on, students can only select a term once. As you can see here, it's given me an error because I've selected education for all four definitions. This error won't go away until I select a different term for each definition. If I don't have this setting enabled, then whenever a student goes to fill out the form, they would be able to select education for every single definition. This same feature is also going to be found under the checkbox grid question. The next More menu option I want to talk about is response validation. This is an option if you are using the question type short answer, paragraph, or checkboxes. Each of these question types has slightly different options for response validation. Now, when you hear the term response validation, I want you to think of it as a gatekeeper for your form. It makes sure that any responses being entered meet the requirements that you've set for that question. It can be used as a tool for standardizing your data, giving immediate feedback to students where they can't move on until they get a question correct, or even to help you gamify your lessons. I wish that we had enough time for me to demo all the different ways that I can think of to use this tool, but I really don't think you want to sit and listen to me talk for that long. So I'm going to try to cover the basics, and then I'm going to leave it up to you and your creative mind to take it from there. We're going to begin with a short answer question, and I'm going to click on the More menu and select Response Validation. For short answers, you can require the response to be a number, text, a certain length, or a regular expression, which allows you to specify a pattern that the response text must match. Using regular expressions can quickly become complex, so we're not going to dive into it in this course. As an example of how to use response validation, we're just going to use the math problem question. Let's say for this question, I only want to accept numbers and not text as a response. And when I say that, this is what I mean. I want students to enter a 4 as a response, not FOUR. So to do this, I'm going to select number, then I'm going to select is number. Now, as you can see, when I preview the form, if I enter FOUR, it's going to say must be a number. However, if I enter 3, it's going to accept that as a response because it is a number. Now, if I wanted to set it up where my students could not move on in the form until they put in the correct answer, I could change the response validation to look something like this. I would put number is equal to 4. Pro tip, you always want to customize the error text. If you don't, Google is going to show your students the correct answer. Let me show you what I'm talking about. If I come into my form and let's say I read this as 2 minus 2 and type in a 0, it's going to say must be a number equal to 4. Well, I don't want it to tell them that the answer is 4. So if I come back to my form and type an error message like try again, when my student fills it out incorrectly, they're then going to see my try again message. And they aren't going to be able to submit the form until this answer is correct. Now, you may have seen or heard of some people using Google Forms to create digital locks for a breakout room. This is how they go about doing it: response validation. Once students have solved the puzzle, they would then enter a numeric sequence. If it's correct, the form would allow them to move on. I've also seen it used as a password to keep students out of a form until a teacher is ready for them to be in it. Now, if you're thinking about creating digital locks for a breakout room, you could also use text in addition to numbers. For text response validation, you can require submissions to contain or exclude specific text, be formatted as an email or a URL. Length allows you to set a maximum and a minimum character count. You might use this if you ask a yes or no question, but you want your students to justify their thinking. To ensure they aren't giving you just a one-word response, you can require that they use a minimum character count. For example, maybe you want them to write a complete sentence, so you say they have to use a minimum of 20 characters. Short answer is going to give you the most options for response validation. Under paragraph, you're only going to have the option to enter response validation by length or regular expression. Under checkboxes for response validation, you can set how many checkboxes must be selected by signifying select at least 2, select at most 2, or select exactly 2. This is perfect if you're wanting to design a more complex assessment or if your students fail to read directions where it says, please select 2 answers, and they select 1 or they select 3. Response validation is going to force them to select the correct number of answers. Response validation has so many amazing applications, and we've really only scratched the surface of how to use it. If you'd be interested in a make and take where we create a breakout room with digital locks together, please send me a comment and let me know. Next, let's explore form branching. This feature is known by a variety of names, but it allows you to show a respondent specific content based on how they answer a question. Think of it as a personalized path through your form or a way for you to sequence learning. If you were to ask me what my favorite feature of Google Forms is, other than its integration with Sheets, I would probably answer form branching. Branching can be used to create differentiated content review, choose your own adventure activities, gamified learning with an amazing race experience, and more. Branching isn't hard, but it's not what I would classify as a beginner skill. Most importantly, it's going to require pre-planning. Let me show you how it works in a quick demo. I teach a Google Level 1 Bootcamp course, so I might want to create a form where I ask my students if they know how to complete certain skills in the Google Workspace. Based on how a student responds, they're going to be taken to different sections of the form. For example, this first question, can you organize and manage bookmarks effectively in Chrome? If they say yes, they're automatically going to be taken to the next question. If they say no, they'll then be taken to a section with a video where they can review how to organize and manage bookmarks. Then underneath, I've asked them to list at least 2 things they learned about managing their bookmarks in Chrome. They have to answer this before they can move on to the next section. Once they answer, they'll be taken to the exact same question as the student who answered yes, which is about tab management. For the student who answers kind of, I also decided to route them to the review video as well. Now, you might have noticed that the only question types you saw were multiple choice. And that's because you can only create form branches if you have a multiple choice or drop-down question. Form branching requires a question where students are only allowed to make a single choice. So let's walk through how to create this kind of magic in your own form. We're going to be following 4 simple steps. Step 1, make a plan. 2, create sections with no questions and name the sections. 3, add your questions. 4, set your branching. I'm going to quickly clear up my form, then we'll build a branching example together. All right, step number 1, make a plan. Now, personally, whenever I'm planning out form branching, I like to make my plan on paper, but since that would be difficult for you to see, I'm going to try my best to do it digitally. For my first section, I like to start out with the information I want to collect from everyone. Think of this as your demographics information. So this is going to be email, first name, last name, class period, etc. As I mentioned earlier when we were in the Google Sheets portion of this module, if you plan on doing any kind of sorting with your data, always ask for it in an individual question. In section 2, I'm going to ask my first question. Something I frequently get asked is, can you have multiple questions in one section? The answer is yes, but you're only going to be able to branch off one question at a time. In our case, we're going to be branching based on how students respond to question 1. If they get question 1 correct, I'm going to want to automatically send them to question 2. However, if they get it incorrect, I'm going to want to send them to a quick reteach and allow them to possibly reattempt the question or give them a similar question where they can try the concept again. So I'm going to call this question 1 reteach. After they finish with the question 1 reteach, I want to send them to question 2. So now everybody's at question 2. From question 2, we have another opportunity to branch. Now let's say they get question 2 correct. Well, we're going to want to send them to question 3. What if they get question 2 wrong? Then we're going to want to set up a section for a question 2 reteach. Again, once they finish with the reteach, we're going to want to send them to question 3. Now let's say for the purposes of our demonstration here that if they answer question 3 correctly, they're going to be sent to an assessment that I'm actually going to record the grade for in the gradebook. If they get question 3 wrong, they're going to be given one more opportunity for a reteach, and then they also will be sent directly to the assessment. Now, as you can see, form branching can quickly get complex, which is why it's so important to think through your plan ahead of time. For 4 questions and an assessment, I ended up with 8 sections. Now we're going to move on to step 2, which is create sections. And I'm going to create the sections based on my plan. As I create them, I'm also going to name them, which is going to make my life infinitely easier when it comes time to set up branching. So I'm going to pop back over to my Google form, and I'm quickly going to pop in my information for the first section, which was my demographics. So it's already collecting email, so I'm going to have it collect first name, last name, and class period. And I like to use a drop down for class period. Then I'm going to add a new section by clicking the add section icon in the insert menu. Now looking at the planning that we did earlier, this is going to be called question 1. I also want a section called question 1 reteach. Then I'm going to move on to question 2, question 2 reteach, and so on and so forth. Step number 3 is to create questions. Begin by clicking on the section you want to add a question to, then click the plus icon. Remember, when you add your questions, you can only branch from a multiple choice or a drop-down question. To make this easier on myself, I'm just going to label this as question 1. Then I'm going to say correct, incorrect, incorrect 2, and incorrect 3. Then I'm going to want to click on the More menu and click Shuffle Option Order. After you've added all your questions, it's time for step 4, where we're going to set our branching. I'm going to begin by clicking on the More menu for a question and check Go to Section based on answer. For the correct answer, I'm going to want to send students to the next question, which is question 2. And this is why it was so important that we named our sections as we created them. If a student chooses the incorrect answer, then I want to send them to question 1 reteach. Now we come down to the question 1 reteach. After a student completes the question 1 reteach, I automatically want to send them on to question 2. I can control this through this after section 3 drop down. So after this section, I want them to go to question 2. You would then continue to set your branching throughout the rest of the form until you've successfully navigated all of your students to the very last question, where they can then press submit. As you might have noticed when you're form branching, your form can quickly grow very long. However, there's no rule that says you have to have everything in a single form. You could easily have students finish with the first form, then once they press submit, put the link to the next form in the confirmation message. As we mentioned during Module 1, this would be an easy procedure or routine to teach, that your students always check the confirmation message for their next steps. Finally, step 5, which wasn't really included in my original steps. When you're dealing with form branching, you're going to want to preview your form and make sure everything is working the way you think it's going to. So I'm going to quickly fill out my form. And if I click on the correct option, it should take me to question 2, which it does. If I click on the incorrect option, it's going to take me to question 1 reteach. When I click next, it takes me to question 2. I know the example that I gave in the video for form branching was about content review, but you can use it in so many other ways. For example, my husband came to me recently and he needed to set up a Google form for participants to fill out to show that they had attended a PD session. In the past, they had created 24 different Google Forms, each with their own QR code. And I looked at him and I said, well, why don't you just create one form with form branching and response validation? And he looked at me and said, huh? So we sat down and we figured out that a participant could select a session name and they would be branched to where they could enter a code for that particular session. We then used response validation to set up a code for the session. After the session has concluded, he can then go in and change the code, which means participants would no longer be able to get credit for that session. That's just one of the magical ways that you can use Google Forms. I know that you are going to think of many more, and I can't wait to either hear about them or brainstorm about them with you. Thank you so much for joining the Educate community today for Module 2 about advanced form topics. If you're interested in more tips and tutorials on all things EdTech, be sure to check out our channel. In the meantime, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you'll be notified each time we post new content. See you next time.